Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice, and I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Tanis McDonald. Tanis is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University. She has her PhD in English with a specialization in Canadian literature. Her current research focuses on modernist and contemporary poetry. She's also the editor of the Laurier Poetry Series, part of Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and the author of several books, including her most recent, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female, a collection of essays about the importance of walking, being female while doing it, and the social commentary that emerges from it. Tanis is also a very active and vocal advocate for the study and support of contemporary Canadian poets. This four-part series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this first episode, we're introduced to Dr. Tanis McDonald, the Laurier Poetry Series, and how the series is designed to help support poetry instruction as well as provide a convenient gateway to modern and contemporary Canadian poetry. Okay, welcome to the program, Tanis.
Thanks very much, Bill. Lovely to be here.
Excellent. So why don't we start getting to know you a little bit more and wondering if you could talk a little bit about your current research and your association with the Wilfrid Laurier University Press.
I have long been a scholar interested in Canadian writing in general and Canadian poetry specifically. I wrote my dissertation on feminist poetry, the feminist elegy in Canada as it was being produced at the time, and I've been an elegy specialist and a Canadian literature specialist at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, since I can't always teach the elegy, I teach all forms of poetry as well. I teach poetry writing and poetry as an academic scholarly pursuit, as well as other forms of feminist writing. And I became associated first with Wilfrid Laurier University Press when Neil Besner contacted me to ask me to edit a volume in the Laurier Poetry Series.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my volume was published in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
So it was one of the first of those series. And I also sit on, and I was asked to sit on the board a little later when I actually was hired at Wilfrid Laurier University, which was a little bit of a coincidence, but everything came together. And I think they knew that, if they had one of their editors from the poetry series actually in the building, that it would be a good idea to get me more involved.
Right. Yeah, that is a nice little coincidence there. Right? And so you note in your bio that you spent some years outside of academia as a support worker. I'm very curious about that time. Can you talk a little bit about that and whether it had an impact on your writing? I imagine it probably did. And what brought you back to the academic world?
Yeah, I worked in the AIDS community for many years as a frontline support worker in palliative care, and I think while that was very complex, it had a simple beginning in that I was interested in the social justice work of care work at that time. And so I spent a number of years in that community doing that kind of work. And I also taught at-risk youth and did a number of other things. And so I just mentioned that I started my academic career as an elegy specialist. And of course, that came out of those kinds of years and thinking about public mourning and the rituals of public mourning and who gets to mourn whose bodies and why. And so while I didn't write my dissertation about literature written about people with AIDS, I was interested in looking at the kinds of mourning and the kinds of grief that was rejected, the kinds that were accepted. And I will tell you that when I first started writing that kind of work, I was admonished by several professors that this wasn't an au courant project. and I should try to do something that was a little more in line. And I thought, that's interesting. And then 911 happened, and all of a sudden the discourse on public mourning was everywhere.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, you have an out of step dissertation. Wait a few months, right?
Right.
Right. So far from saying that I wanted to capitalize on that, I was already saying that public mourning was important and something to pay attention to. And then, of course, a public tragedy underscored that idea.
So help us understand why your topic was not quite in favor at that point. I think, what makes a dissertation in favor versus out of favor, or in style or out,
Yeah, I think
according to your academic. Yeah.
in some ways, I think it depends largely on something we're not supposed to mention, like subjective taste,
Mm,
right? What the people I was talking to, the professors I was talking to, thought was cutting edge, right?
mm,
And there's lots of emphasis on what is topical,
okay.
right? And that's not wrong. I wouldn't
Hmm.
say, that it's categorically not wrong, but, I think, particularly since I was writing about contemporary literature,
Mm,
those of us who work in contemporary literature get that a lot. I think, um, if you're working in the 18th century, I think, that's a little, you have to be topical a little bit less. But I think even my colleagues who work in more historical literatures, do have to keep an eye on what hasn't been written so far about that era, right? You don't
mm,
want to just be producing the same sort of research over and over
right,
again.
right.
And it's especially important for a dissertation that the young researcher is carving out an area for themselves, right? So that's very important. And I think people just were, I mean, who knows? Some of it might be that people didn't want to read like a lot of sad poetry.
Right.
There's that,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
I mean, that's a thing. But anyway, they had to anyway, because I wrote it anyway. So there you
Yeah,
go.
there you go. So yeah, let's talk about the Laurier Poetry Series a little bit. What was its origin and mission, and maybe go into a little bit more detail on when and why you joined as an editor.
Well, the Laurier Poetry Series has been running for much longer than since I joined it. It
Mm,
began in 2003, and I wasn't privy to those conversations, but it looks to me like Neil Besner, who was the original editor for the series, and Brian Henderson, who was director of Wilfrid Laurier University Press at the time, put their heads together sometime in 2003 and said, let's start a selected poetry series where they could put between two covers a selection of about 30 to 35 poems from a single poet's career, accompanied by an introduction by the editor. So a part scholarly, part sort of cultural history
hmm.
of the poetry, and have an afterword written by the poet at the end. And in the case of posthumous volumes, it would be written by someone who was a scholar of that particular work, or a friend, often
Mm,
a kind of colleague. Um, so this was their idea, and it was a very good one because their aims were to produce these affordable, slenderish volumes that would introduce curious undergrad students or curious general readers to a kind of overview of someone's work. And the idea was to capture sort of the dynamic of a number of years of work. So this wouldn't be, so it's not all new poetry, although every once in a while, if we, an author, pardon me, a poet that we are publishing will say, I just wrote this, it was just published last year in a magazine, can I slip that one in? And
mm,
that's fine. That's still, selected poetry. So it's, so that kind of scholarly and cultural positioning kind of introduction and the poet's comments at the end serve to situate all of that work and talk about how it's been read and what it means to the poet to write and to live life as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted them to be inexpensive,
Right.
available, right, and accessible to both general readers and undergraduate students.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we didn't want it to be a kind of Festschrift or something that very, very scholarly that would attract only experts. We wanted to entice people to read more poetry, as opposed to give them ways into it, as opposed to ways that they can be pushed out of it.
Right.
So that was Neil and Brian, and Neil was the general editor of the series for 15 years. No, wait, longer, 17 years. And Brian joined him in the final 3 years of his tenure. When Brian retired as director of the press, he joined Neil in co-editing that series. And then they both retired or would start talking about retirement and leaving the series to someone else in 2018, which is when Siobhan McMenemy, who is the acquisitions editor for the press, came and talked to me and said, how about taking this over, as Neil and Brian are both retiring? And that's when I joined. and they were very nice. I sort of joined as a part of the editorial team for the final 3 volumes that they were working with, that they were in final stages with. So I got to be sort of a fly on the wall as they edited, and I could add in my own editorial comments.
Mm-hmm.
Again, just small things that I had spotted. And yeah, so I felt very, very welcomed into it.
That's excellent. Yeah, we interviewed Nduka Antonio not too long ago.
Oh, did you?
Yeah,
awesome
for this podcast.
I have his volume Displace
there you go.
here.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah,
yeah,
we loved that one. That was a great series. So what was the volume you put together?
The volume I put together in 2008 was Selected Poetry of Di Brandt, the Manitoba Mennonite writer and feminist writer. And she's very much still producing books. She had a book out last year, right? But she started publishing quite young and had a whole career by the early 2000s. So. Yeah, so the series has sort of straddled an older generation of poets and a generation of poets that are still writing now. And part of my interest is in making sure that stays current.
Right.
That we're looking at poets probably in mid-career, or people who have published a handful of very, very influential or very popular books that unfortunately have gone out of print, because that's what poetry does. It goes out of print.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry that it's true, but it is. And this is one of our interests in alleviating that.
Yeah.
I went to teach a book by Lillian Allen a couple of years ago, and it was out of print. And I thought, it's Lillian Allen. She is the godmother of dub poetry in Canada. The fact that that's out of print is a national crime. And that was the very first thing I said to Siobhan. I said, well, I'll think about this. I'll think about taking over the general editorship of the series. But if I do, the very first thing I'm going to ask for is I want a volume of Lillian Allen selected. And Siobhan said that was kind of the moment she knew I was interested, because I started making demands.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's not too much to ask, I would think. Yeah. Which I'm glad you brought that up, because that leads me nicely into the next question, which is, you do have some very practical reasons for continuing the series, and and these reasons very much intersect with your passion for teaching poetry. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, as I said, it really matters that a book is in print, or that it's available to teach to students. And it's part of what I often talk to them about Canadian literature and telling them that, literature, particularly contemporary literature, is always marked by how much it is going to sell, how much it will be taught, and how much people will be talking about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I often say to them that I'm afraid that this is how capitalism works, and not that I endorse it, but I live within it. That unless it sells, it doesn't stay in print. If it doesn't stay in print, I can't teach it to you. If I can't teach it to you, it's not going to be influential on you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
And so that's a huge thing. And I remember early in my teaching career, I was teaching from an anthology, because that's often how poetry comes to us, right? Anthology of Canadian poetry from 1950 to 2000 or whatever. And
Right.
I think those anthologies definitely have a place. And I think for a first year course, that's often the way to go. But I remember hearing a lot of writers, particularly poets, saying, teach out of full books. And I thought, they're right. Put more full books on the syllabus. And when I started to do that, students were justifiably confused, because they had literally never seen a volume of poetry before. Many of them had not seen a volume of poetry before. And it's not their fault, because poetry is marketed to us often as these single short lyrics.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a bad thing to have single short lyrics, and it's not a bad thing to have an anthology, but they needed to know that there was poetry publishing beyond that,
Mm-hmm.
that people write entire books about a single subject, just like one would with a novel, but instead of, a narrative, it's 100 lyric pieces on a single subject, right? Or
Exactly.
maybe 100 lyric pieces that have a narrative to
Mm.
it, but that there are different ways of using language. There are different ways of accessing this kind of art, and poetry is one of them.
You just heard from Dr. Tanis McDonald. Tanis is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University, editor of the Laurier Poetry Series, and author of several books, including her most recent, Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female. Join us next week as we discuss some of the unique characteristics of Canadian poetry and the urgency in maintaining the instruction of that poetry. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press.
I don't really know why they're getting minimized, other than the fact that fiction seems to be kind of an amorphous blob that will take up all the room that we give it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And and who knows whether that's people yielding, whether it's a vicious circle that our faculty's yielding to to express student wants. And if the students say, we'd rather have more short fiction and novels, but are they asking for that because their encounters with poetry are limited,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they don't know that they can ask for poetry, right? They don't know that they can advocate for more work that does that engages with language in that way.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant, Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.